today we're going to be talking about chapter 26, section 2, and it's called Self-Rule for the British Colonies. So Great Britain has a lot of experience in this whole ruling the world business because A, they had the biggest empire ever, and B, they also don't rule the world anymore, so something happened. Let's see how that played out. Speaking of Britain, one of the most famous former British colonial colonies is Canada. We all like Canada, right? I mean, I'm happy to talk about them because it's our friendly neighbor to the north. It's a beautiful place. There's tons of public land that you should absolutely go and explore in Canada. And then what do they have to deal with in the South? Well, leave it to Robin Williams to say it better than I could. And again, back to Canada. Let's just kind of spitball some history here. So how did relations go between the American colonies and Great Britain? Long story short, they went badly. We started dumping their stuff in harbors. We started throwing rocks at police. And before you knew it, we said, we don't want to be friends anymore, Great Britain. And so a few years later, they came and burned our White House down. That is a thing that happened. Canada, meanwhile, well, they had a much longer, slower, much friendlier transition toward independence. And so that's what we're going to be exploring today. I can't help myself. But really, I'm going to try to be somewhat serious about this. But it's hard because, well, when you talk about a people with a peaceful history, sometimes it can be a little boring. Because there's no, genocide and horrid murder and revolution and rock throwing at police and whatnot. No, the Canadians just get along. And their relationship with Britain is rather close. Who else came from Canada? Yeah. If you don't know him, William Shatner, the famous Captain Kirk, was a Canadian. Who else was a Canadian? Yeah, you should totally recognize Jim Carrey in his Dumb and Dumber days. Also a Canadian. I mean, what would we do without these guys? There'd be no Ace Ventura. There'd be no Star Trek. I mean, come on. Yeah, I mean, really, where would we be without Canada? I know. You can take notes later, or you can write about Austin Powers. Yes, another famous Canadian. Yeah. See, where would you be? I don't even know who that is. I kid. Okay. Yeah, another famous Canadian. You're welcome, Canada. You're welcome. Yeah. But my all-time favorite, the most famous, fearsome Canadian. Sometimes they can be violent. Oh, wait. No, this one's a fictional character, so maybe they're not actually violent. Well, yeah. There was also, a Marvel Comics team from Canada. That's all I know about them, so moving on. Anyway, a little more about Canada for you. Canada was originally home to a lot of Native Americans because dating back tens of thousands of years when people crossed the land bridge that is now the Bering Strait, well, these nomadic people migrated all over the Western Hemisphere. But many of them stayed and settled in Canada. And then, 1500s, as Europeans were moving in, along the east coast of Canada, primarily French colonists were settling. But yet, if you go to the western provinces in Canada, or even the central provinces, they're predominantly English descendants. And so, there was some tension. There may have been some spilled maple syrup or an argument or, I don't know. Yeah. Maybe some fisticuffs occurred at some point in their history because at some point there was a split There was Upper Canada, controlled by the English, and there was Lower Canada, controlled by the French. And while this formal division did ease some cultural tensions, let's be honest, really these places are just controlled by the rich people like everywhere else. Now, as the middle class living in Canada began to demand more reform, this actually did produce some kind of violent instance throughout the 1830s when really a lot of different former colonies were declaring their independence. And eventually, the British Parliament approved self-rule for Canada. So, whereas instead, in 1776, we said, Britain, go away, Canada said, pretty please, and after a few decades, they had their own country.
Have some fudge. Just leave me alone.
Didn't you hear him? We're your worst nightmare.
My worst nightmare involved a pack of rabid wolves. I was stuck somewhere in the Yukon, and there were tall, skinny rabbits, and they were drinking heavily.
Just shut up. We want your prisoner. Now, where is she?
I don't know what you're talking about. Hey.
A boot. It's about what we're talking about. And enough of that A business. You're gonna learn how to talk right, understand?
We got ways of making you pronounce the letter O.
I want my honey. Now get the keys for the cells now. Now! Easy. Easy. Okay, Mr. Canuck. Mr. Two-time World Series winner. Hey, what's that fancy move?
See, this is all the prisoners we have. This man was arrested for putting regular gas into an unleaded tank.
Where do you think you're going?
Going over to show you the next guy.
All right, nice and easy. One step at a time, buddy.
This man was arrested for being in too many bad moods.
I got you covered, I got you covered, I got you covered, buddy.
This man raided a company, merged it with his conglomerate, and then fired all the employees. Get away from the bar, you scum!
Hold on, Jack! Now you tell us where Honey is. Let me paint a picture for you, buddy. She's petite, extremely beautiful, and heavily armed.
Wait, you mean the litter bug? They took her to the capital to give her a free mental health examination.
Good. The capital, Toronto.
No. The capital of Canada is Ottawa.
Yeah, right. Do we look that stupid? Ottawa.
Nice try, Dudley.
All right, boys. We're going to Toronto.
The name Canada has been in use since the earliest European settlements and comes from the Huron and Iroquois First Nations word Kanata, meaning village. Canada became a country in 1867 with the passing of the British North America Act by Great Britain, who had won the whole eastern half of what is now North America by defeating France in the 7 Years' War in 1763. This act, with its subsequent amendments, embodied the written Constitution of Canada for more than a century. The first Prime Minister of Canada was Sir John A. Macdonald, who brought British Columbia into the Confederation in 1871 and began construction of the Transcontinental Railway. Newfoundland was the last province to join Canada in 1949. Canada is now one of the world's wealthiest nations, with a high per capita income, oil and gas reserves second only to Saudi Arabia, and a special economic status as a member of the G8 group of 8 nations.
So, once Canada was given self-rule, you know, there was a movement to start a more centralized government. Because, again, when you look at Canada, it's huge. I mean, the Northwest Territories are bigger than the Southeast United States, and that's just kind of one province. I mean, Quebec is, I mean, these places are huge. So the effort was some type of centralized government to protect their interest. Because since Canada was a huge country, the concern was that it wasn't densely populated enough to protect itself. And so the need for protection actually created the Dominion of Canada. Now, the Dominion of Canada in 1867 was its own country, but it still considered itself part of the British Empire. Like I said, they maintained these close relationships between themselves and Great Britain. So the first Prime Minister of Canada was John Macdonald. He, in fact, expanded the territory from ocean to ocean and even constructed the first transcontinental railroad.
All right, fellas, all right. Just act normal, all right? Act normal. Not normal for us, normal like for regular people.
Good day.
Hi.
May I see your license and registration, please?
There you go.
Thank you. Oh, Americans. Welcome to Ontario. Sportsman's paradise.
Isn't it, though?
Would you please get out and step away from the vehicle? Okay. What is wrong with this picture?
No snow tires.
No.
I was, driving on the wrong side of the road. I can explain that. You see, I'm not used to your rules up here, and I was...
That's not it. This writing on the side of your vehicle.
Oh! How did that get those kids at the garage? I just stopped for, like...
Whatever. My concern is the sensibilities of a certain distinct and viable part of Canadian society. Les Québécois.
Huh?
You know, wine drinkers, pea soup eaters, French Canadians.
Oh, yeah, those guys, sure.
If you wish to avoid prosecution, I would advise that you comply with our language laws, which specifically prescribe that all signs be in both English and French, Canada's 2 official languages.
Okay.
I do have to fine you. That'll be $1,000 Canadian, or 10 American dollars if you'd prefer.
Oh, no, I'll pay the American there, yeah. There you go, buddy. What do you want, 10? Thank you very much.
There's your receipt.
Thank you.
And now, in French, if you please.
All right, so moving on to a different colony. Once more, Britain used to govern colonies on all sides of the planet. They had the largest global empire. But now, the British Isles are most of what is left of the former British Empire. And all of these places like Canada, like Australia, like New Zealand have been given their independence. Now in 1769, Captain Cook, famous British explorer, claimed part of New Zealand as part of the British Empire. In fact, he claimed it as part of Australia, which Australia was once formed as a penal colony. Which a penal colony means that the island of Australia, once upon a time, was a giant prison. The entire island. And when there were Aborigines that date back tens of thousands of years on the continent of Australia. But the British residents living in Australia were sent there against their will. They were prisoners. And when Captain Cook claimed New Zealand as part of this, he was authorizing the British to send prisoners there as well. But New Zealand at the time was largely populated by a group called the Maori. These are the native people of New Zealand. And then Australia's native people were called Aborigines. Now, after these prisoners in Australia had served their sentence, they were allowed to stay to buy land to reside, and most did.
Australia is a land of striking beauty and diversity. From its cities to its lush forests to its arid outback, the world's smallest continent leaves travelers spellbound. Australia also has an amazing and often harsh history. The first settlers, called Aborigines by Europeans, arrived thousands of years ago, probably from Southeast Asia. Then in 1770, the explorer Captain James Cook claimed Australia for Britain. European settlers began to arrive, and the Aborigine population suffered disastrously. Surprisingly, most of the first European settlers did not come to Australia voluntarily. They were forced to migrate. They were convicts who had been sentenced to deportation. For years, British courts had sent convicts to the American colonies, but that destination had been eliminated by the American Revolution and American independence. As a result, British jails began to overflow with prisoners. Many were dangerous criminals who had committed serious offenses. But many others were poor people from Britain's growing cities, whose only crime was that they were unable to pay their debts. And others were political prisoners. Often they were Irish who had taken action against British rule. To solve the problem of prison overcrowding, British officials developed a daring scheme. They would turn Australia into a penal colony for convicts. The first ships arrived in Australia in 1788. More than 150,000 convicts were eventually transported to the continent. Australian officials used convict labor to clear the land. They planted crops and established herds of sheep and other livestock. The government also forced prisoners to work on public projects, such as the construction of government buildings and roads. Convicts were dispersed throughout the colony to provide free labor to settlers. While the convicts spent their days making Australia comfortable for others, they themselves lived under extremely harsh conditions. When they weren't working, they were constantly watched by guards. Their small and windowless cells exposed the prisoners to heat and cold. The convicts were forced to wear heavy chains on their legs that prevented them from escaping. After they finished serving their sentence, they could enter society as free citizens. But for some, the wait for freedom was too long. Escape was difficult, but not impossible. Convicts were able to break their chains with the tools they used for work projects. After freeing themselves, they ran into the wilderness, hoping never to be found. As a result of social reforms, the last convict ship arrived in Australia in 1849. British officials attracted free citizens to immigrate to Australia by giving them free land. The new settlers felt superior to the Aborigines that they were pushing off the land. They also looked down on the convicts and former convicts who came before them.
It was very important to people to be the people who weren't convicts, to make sure that everybody knew they weren't convicts. They didn't want to be mistaken for one of them.
As more settlers arrived and as convicts continued to finish their terms, Australians were creating a national identity for themselves. They didn't want to be a colony of the British Empire. They wanted to have a government of their own. In 1901, Britain helped the colony become the independent Commonwealth of Australia. Its democratic government was based on a constitution that drew on both the American and British models. Australia kept its ties to Britain by recognizing the British monarch as its head of state. Today, Australians look back at their past with both pride and curiosity. The days of the penal colony are gone forever. But Australians remember the men and women who were forced to migrate to Australia on prison ships, who cleared the land and built the cities. They and their descendants remain an enduring part of every Australian's heritage.
Now, eventually, the continent's status as a penal colony went away, and people settled in both locations. Settlers there brought in sheep, brought in domesticated animals. The government, in fact, encouraged immigration, offering cheap land to whoever wanted to come and settle, because Australia, as a large island, had a very small population. The British generally preferred to maintain a policy of indirect rule, meaning don't mess with us and we'll go about your business. Practice your religion, live your life, that's fine. All we need from you guys are taxes and for you to obey the laws. So the British recognized the Maori territorial rights. They said, hey, these are our lands. And Britain said, fine, whatever. Again, the idea of indirect rule is allowing people to live their lives with independence, with dignity. In fact, allowing localized self-government. Meaning the Maori did their own thing. They paid their taxes to the British government because they are part of the British Empire, but otherwise they did their own thing. Self-government. How did that play out? So in theory, that's wonderful. So throughout the early 1900s, Australia, New Zealand got limited self-rule. The Australians, in fact, were the first in the world to utilize the secret ballot. That means Jocelyn doesn't have to tell people who she votes for. It's nobody else's business but hers if she doesn't want to. In 1893, New Zealand was actually the first country in the world to give women the right to vote. However, the unfortunate story had little to do with the larger British self-government policy. It's just the fact that colonists and natives often don't get along. Because after all, colonists are encroaching on native territories, and often many Maori and Aborigines were killed throughout this process. In fact, the biggest killer of native peoples in New Zealand and Australia was, just like in the New World, disease. Now, English expansion into the dominion of, or domination of Ireland dates back many, many hundreds of years, into the 1100s. So the English have maintained influence over Ireland since the 1100s. But when the Protestant Reformation was going on through the 14 and 1500s, most Irish people retained their Catholic cultural heritage. In fact, when England separated itself from the Catholic Church, Ireland chose to stay with the Catholic Church. But Ireland, meanwhile, was a colony of England. So they were supposed to do what England told them to do. But making someone change their religion does not work. And it often leads to violence. And unfortunately, that has been the case in Ireland. Over the years, the issue of Catholicism versus Protestantism has been a sore spot in relations between Great Britain and Ireland until 1829. At that point, it became legal finally for Catholics in Ireland to practice their faith without persecution. But also in the mid-1800s, a terrible famine broke out in Ireland. It was called the potato blight. And there was a small beetle that was eating all of the potatoes in Ireland. And this beetle was wiping out food supplies. Potatoes are one of the most versatile and hardy crops in the world. You can throw a potato out the window, and 2 weeks later there will be a potato plant. And 3 weeks later you can eat it. They are that versatile. They're that hardy. They produce multiple harvests every season. And you can cut it into 10 pieces and it will make 10 potatoes. I mean, it is a staple crop. It grows under horrible conditions, and as a result, it was the staple crop of Ireland. I mean, go to an Irish pub. What are you going to get? You're going to get fries and some kind of meat. Yeah, fish and chips. Pot roast, potatoes. It's the staple crop of every Irish dish you can think of. Why? Well, again, it grows in harsh climates. Ireland is somewhat of a harsh climate. When the potato could not survive, it led to the deaths of over 1 million people. It led to the deaths of over 1 million people. And tens of millions of Irish people began fleeing the country, many of whom came to the United States. If you have Irish ancestors, I would almost bet they came here during the potato famine.
In 1845, Ireland's potato harvests, long a staple of the Irish diet, began to blacken and die. A deadly fungus was ravaging potato crops throughout Europe. In Ireland, the blight caused a horrible famine that the Irish called the Great Hunger. It killed 1 million or more people and forced many others to leave the country. Many Irish people viewed the famine as yet another of the devastating injustices they had been forced to endure under centuries of English rule. The English conquest and domination of Ireland had begun with invasions in the 1100s. English and Scottish settlers colonized Ireland and took possession of most of the best farmland. Irish peasants were forced to farm land owned by powerful absentee landlords who controlled vast estates from their homes in England. Absentee landlords didn't demand only labor from the peasants living on their land. The Irish were also forced to pay high rents. And even though the vast majority of the Irish were Catholic, they had to give a portion of their earnings to the Church of England, which was Protestant. Irish peasants lived in desperate poverty. Under British rule, most of Ireland's farmland was used to grow wheat and oats that were exported to England. The potato, introduced from America, became the main source of food for most poor Irish peasants. That is why the potato blight, which struck in 1845 and lasted for years, was a death sentence to so many. Barley and oat crops were not affected, but instead of providing food to the peasants, absentee landlords continued to ship their crops out of Ireland. Many peasants had nothing to eat except grass, leaves, and the rotten potatoes. In public workhouses, desperate inmates traded hard labor for starvation rations of meager, watery soup. Starvation and disease spread throughout the Irish countryside. Whole villages were filled with the dead and dying. A growing number could not make their rent payments, and the landlords dealt with them swiftly and harshly. Those who could not pay their rent were evicted from their homes and left to survive any way that they could. Irish peasants realized that they were in a struggle for their lives. Many fought against their absentee landlords by refusing to pay rent and banding together to prevent evictions. However, Ireland was still a British colony at the time, and the absentee landlords had British law and British soldiers on their side.
And this great famine not only did it affect the food supply, but it also affected farmers' livelihood. I mean, this is the mid-1800s. Most people in Ireland are still farmers. Staple crop is potatoes. You're basically wiping out the income of the average Irish farmer who could not pay their debts, ergo their land was seized and they were evicted, millions of whom fled to the United States, to Canada, to Australia, or even to Great Britain.
Irish nationalists turned to violence in their quest for reform and self-rule. They believed that the Irish people, not the English government, should govern Ireland. While the nationalists tried to liberate their country, the blight spread across all of Europe, claiming at least 1 million victims in Ireland alone. As starvation and disease swept the country, many were left with a frightening choice: abandon Ireland and live, or stay and die. With few options, approximately 1.5 million Irish left their homes and their families for America, a land of opportunity and hope. A few would return, but most would never see Ireland again. The desperate men and women who immigrated to the United States built new lives in some of the nation's largest cities. Though it was difficult to start over in a new country, the Irish immigrants and their descendants gradually overcame poverty and discrimination. Through patience, education, and hard work, the descendants of the men and women who migrated to America were able to win the fair treatment that the Irish of the 1800s had been denied.
Now, the Irish people that stayed continued to protest for home rule, that is, localized control over their own affairs. This was finally granted to them in 1914, though it was held off because of the First World War. And during the war, there was an attempt at an uprising. The Irish people tried to gain their independence from Great Britain during the war, hoping they would be distracted by the First World War. And ever since then, there has been a group operating in Ireland. They're a nationalist group called the Irish Republican Army. They're still an unofficial group. They're still seeking independence from Great Britain. They still commit acts of violence today.
We must stop dirty. We must stop dirty language from getting to our children's ears. We must go fight the source of it. But what is the source? Oh, that's easy. Times have changed. Our kids are getting worse. They won't obey their parents. They just want to fart and curse. Should we blame the government or blame society?
Or should we blame the images on TV?
No!